thinking about it across fields, meaning I've looked everywhere, essentially. I've looked in history, I've looked in military theory, I've looked in law, of course, and it's really not being explored by almost any field. So I decided to take on this project, and essentially what came out of it is like a primer on underground warfare, in a sense that it addresses many different questions related to again, first of all, redrawing a little bit the history of the use of this tactic in war, and also talking about some of the operational complexities of when tunnels are used in war, how does this affect the general course of the conflict, and of course touching on the legal issues that have to do with entering into war as a result of a tunnel, but also conducting a war, the conduct of hostilities when there are tunnels on the battlefield. Yeah.
Is it possible to know a little bit about your background?
My background?
Yes.
Yeah, for sure. So, as my accent perhaps
reveals.
Yeah, exactly. I am actually originally from France, and then I moved to England, where I studied law, and then to the United States. I went to Oxford, I went to Yale, and then I did my PhD in international law at Tel Aviv University. And I've been here for many, many years, and I've been teaching for many years at the ITC.
What is your background on this issue?
My background on this issue is my project, which I've been working on for years. But I didn't have a military, if that's what you're asking, I didn't work in the IDF in a tunnel unit. No. I wish I did, but no.
Oh, yeah.
We can figure out.
I'm not that young. Not that young. How can I say it? Anyway, so that's my background. But in this book, I really try to address both legal issues and non-legal issues so that it would have like a broad appeal. Now, in terms of today, the chapter which I distributed to you, which you may or may not have read, it's not that important anyway, because I'm going to give you an overview of all of this. But the chapter that I circulated is one chapter of the book which deals with a very specific issue, which is the use of tunnels in urban areas, which broadly refers to a kind of the intersection of tunnels in conflict with the civilian world. So either when tunnels are used by civilians or around civilians or against civilians. But I'll get to that later. I just want to tell you that I'm going to try to give you kind of like the context, because I think that's important, but also kind of like delve maybe a little bit more into these issues later. Okay, so these pictures are from Iraq, the Mosul area in 2016, when tunnels are discovered. The reason why I'm bringing up these pictures is for two reasons. First of all, obviously this is a very contemporary threat, tunnels, but also, and it's important for me to make this clear really at the outset, I think the intuition, at least when we live in Israel, and maybe that's perhaps what was behind your question, is, okay, this is an Israeli problem. And certainly the operation of protective edge, in which tunnels were really at the forefront of the battlefield experience in the war between Gaza and Israel, the tunnels were brought to the front of the public discourse in a way that was really kind of like unprecedented in contemporary wars. But by digging a little bit further, it turns out that this is absolutely not a merely Israeli problem, and there have been tunnels almost from time immemorial on the battlefield. And even in today's conflict, we can see various elements of underground warfare in almost every conflict that has been taking place since 9/11, and I'll tell you more about this. But here you see Mosul, you see tunnels, you see one in a restaurant. I mean, here you can get a sense also about the tunnels getting closer to the civilian world. So the points that I'm going to try to make to you today is that I'm going to tell you a little bit about the threat, the scope of the threat, the nature of the threat, but also always maintaining this focus on civilians, and also try to talk to you about how the operational challenges translate into legal dilemmas as well. So as I said, we're not talking about something new, okay? In this sense, there's really nothing surprising. Again, tunnels have been around, and have been used by belligerents in war for as long as war has existed. We have records in the Bible. Here you have pictures of Dura Europos in the 3rd century, the Battle of the Crater in the American Civil War. This is a huge crater, and what you see around it is people in World War I in France. So we're not talking about a new tactic, but what we're witnessing some interesting changes, evolution in the contemporary battlefields that I've been interested in, and I want to share with you some of the insights of the research in this respect. So, like I said, a very global threat, and I'll go through this quickly. But we've seen tunnels, and here you see the contemporary battlefield. Right, we've left history. We're more talking about what's going on right now. In Afghanistan, the Taliban were using mountainous tunnels and caves. In Libya, we're seeing something a little bit different by Gaddafi, a use which is more defensive, a use of the underground, the realm of the underground, but more for defensive purposes, meaning I'm not using the tunnel to go and weaken my enemy, but I'm going to protect myself, a very kind of like conventional idea in a way, by going underground where it's safer and I'm less reachable by enemy forces. So Gaddafi had tunnels in Syria, which is fascinating, and I won't have time to talk too much about it, but that's really the most innovative platform for tunnel warfare these days. Use of tunnel mining, a use of tunnel warfare by both sides of the conflict. And for the first time since World War I, what we see in Syria is actually very, very interesting. We see both sides fighting each other underground, which is quite unusual. So then you can see it's almost like returning to a duel situation, right? You have your enemy, it's like one person in front of another in a very narrow tunnel, fighting each other, looking for each other, trying to find each other before the other side finds them on the ground. And all of this is totally reminiscent of World War I. So Syria is super interesting in that respect. Gaza, of course, I don't need to speak too much about it here. We see a renewed and very, again, innovative use of the underground by Hamas and by the Islamic Jihad. And this is in all variations on the theme, meaning it can be tunnels that are proper on the territory of Gaza. It can be tunnels that are crossing over onto Israel. But mostly, and this is quite interesting, I'll get back to this later, mostly a military use of the tunnels. So we're talking again about the use of underground structures in war. But here, interestingly, in Gaza, those who are in the tunnels are mostly the militants, the members of Hamas, and not civilians. So that's important. Iraq, I mentioned Mosul, but there was also Sinjar. Lots of examples in Iraq of the use of tunnels by ISIS. Egypt, again, this is the Egypt-Gaza border where again, we see tunnels. They were initially smuggling tunnels, and Egypt had a very low tolerance policy for these tunnels that were dug by Hamas onto the territory of Egypt, has taken a whole lot of very aggressive measures against these tunnels. So again, Yemen, there was an attempt at killing the former president by using a tunnel. So this gives you, this gives you a very kind of like, I'm not going to spend too much time into it, but just to set the stage for what is truly a global threat, absolutely not a merely Israeli problem. And, and what's surprising when you look at this is that it's the contrast between what I told you before, which is there's no literature. We have almost no indication by states of how they think about this, what kind of policy they have to deal with underground threats, what kind of maybe special training they have. We know a little bit about Israel, of course, in this respect, but that's about it. What are the challenges of dealing with this kind of threat? So NATO, for example, the NATO countries have all dealt with this threat in one way or another since 9/11, and yet when you look for documents or even when you speak to NATO officials, you basically hit a wall, right? There's very little out there. So what is it that I want to talk about today? It's basically two sets of scenarios that you see here to make it a little bit easier. So you see here the little houses basically symbolize the presence of civilians. Here you don't see the houses, you see mountains. So that's more like Mali, which by the way was not on my map because it's outside the map itself. But Mali, huge use of underground structures and tunnels and caves in the war. against where basically jihadist elements try to take over the northern part of the country, and France and the Chadian forces try to prevail over them, and they really had many issues trying to do that in the Malian terrain. So more mountainous, more Mali, more Afghanistan, right, away from the civilians, where you can basically send your most powerful weapon onto the mountain and hope that this is actually going to destroy the tunnel, in addition to destroying the mountain and everything around it and killing everyone around it, right? So that's a slightly different set of circumstances. But what I'm interested in today to look at is the situation where you have civilians in the vicinity in two sets of circumstances, either on the territory of a single state, so that's state A, right? Or crossing over from the territory of one state to the territory of another state. And these two are the interesting scenarios because they have the little houses around them. Okay, so this is just to kind of like make it more concrete. Now, I said I was going to talk to you a little bit about the threat and how it diffuses and the kind of trends that we've seen since 2000. Click on this, I guess. How do I do this? Any idea how I click on the trends? On Ido, the IT expert.
What do you want to?
I just want to click on this.
Yes, this. Where do you want?
This one, yeah. Is it working? You know what? Okay, fine. I just went forward. It's good enough. Okay, so the trends since 2000, just again to kind of like explain what this thread is actually about. So this data is only used for indicative purposes. Because there's so little material available on underground, on the use of the underground in conflict, I kind of wanted to confirm a lot of the assumptions that I had and a lot of the information that I gathered from here and from there. So what did I do? I took records from the New York Times over the course of, it was 60 years. And I tried to analyze when the word tunnel came up. Of course, not every tunnel is relevant to this. Could be a transport tunnel, but I wanted to get a sense of what were the trends, at least in this kind of literature, since there was no other literature. So this really confirmed a lot of the other more qualitative findings that I came up with, in the sense that we see a rise in the use of underground structures in war, particularly since 9/11, which is quite interesting. Okay, we see also it's more localized. We see a rise in the Middle East and in Asia. The type of actors that are using this tool are mostly non-state actors, which is also quite interesting. And the reason for that is that non-state actors that are typically less technologically savvy or developed, or they have less technological tools at their disposal, and they are very much exposed to the technological capabilities of their opponents. So they're fighting very technologically developed armies like the US, Canada, the UK, France, that are using ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance tools that are very performant, and they are able to find out at all times where they are. They're able to target them using drones and so on. So of course, and again, this is quite intuitive. The non-state actors are finding the underground as a perfect counter equalizer in a way in fighting these more sophisticated armies. So they go underground in order to maintain kind of a level playing field between the two belligerents. And this way they are not findable, their cell phones don't work, and it offers them a refuge and a way to plan operations away from the eye of the drone. And also, by the way, they can hide ammunition, making it more difficult, and I'll talk about this a bit later, also perhaps making more difficult for the enemy to assess what is the military capability of these actors, because if their munitions are underground, it's much more difficult to assess how much they really have. So we see this rise also in cross-border tunnels, and we see a mostly hostile use of tunnels, which is also interesting. But okay, another trend which is very relevant, of course, to our conversation today is that we see that tunnels are moving away from mountains and non-civilian populated areas to civilian populated areas, right? So the tunnels are getting closer to the civilians, and that's a trend that we see at the Turkish-Syrian border. That's a trend we see in Libya. That's a trend we see again in Syria. in Iraq, as you saw before. So again, we see this kind of intersection of the two becoming more prominent. What else do we see? And that's really interesting. It's a cause of concern for civilians, and I explained this more in the paper that I circulated. State practice. So when we look back at how states react to underground threats, it's quite surprising to see the level of force that they exercise in response to these kind of threats. States tend to be very aggressive and to develop almost any kind of weapon or means of warfare that they might have at their disposal in order to counter these kind of threats. And we see this across the board, really. We see states are almost taken over by a sense of helplessness. The tunnels are invisible and they are unpredictable. And that, for some reason, brings states to actually take on and react in very aggressive ways and using very powerful weapons, flamethrowers, thermobaric weapons. And what's even more interesting is that this is somewhat disproportionate to the level of casualties that typically result from underground warfare. So I'm not really talking about Vietnam here, because Vietnam, there were a lot of casualties, but still, there's some element of discrepancy between the casualty that result from the use of tunnels in war and the amount of force that states are willing to deploy in order to counter the threat. So that state practice is concerning, because if you have civilians in the picture, right, and states are willing to do anything to get rid of tunnels, then of course this increases the threat that civilians face, and it increases concern also for this growing intersection, this intertwining of tunnels and civilians. Another reason for concern is, and I've already mentioned this, is this fast diffusion of the tactic across the battlefield. It goes from one battlefield to the next extremely quickly. Today we have the internet. We have we can videotape. The effect. There was an attack in Syria in May 2014, which is known as the Syrian the Aleppo earthquake, because of the effect of this attack. It was a tunnel mining attack under the Carlton Hotel, which was the headquarters of Assad's forces. It was blown up with the most incredible effect, and that video went viral, and it spearheaded and it boosted in a dramatic fashion the use of the underground in the Syrian war, because it was viewed as a huge achievement, and actually as a result of this, and this is the point I wanted to make, what we see, you see maybe the small little square there, as a result of this operation called the Syrian Aleppo earthquake, the mastermind of the operation was asked, wait a second, how did you have the idea of using tunnel mining? Where did this come from? And he said, well, we asked for the advice of our brothers in Gaza. It's because it was perceived as a successful tactic in the Gaza theater that Syrian rebels imported the tactic into their own battlefield, and then from that the whole development of the tactic in the Syrian war continued. But so the diffusion is fast, and so that's another reason for concern. And it's innovative as well. So we have no literature, we have a legal framework which says nothing, absolutely nothing, about even the word tunnel or the reference to the underground. When we're talking about something that's been around for so long and forever, you really wonder why not a single lawyer has ever brought it up, even to say just, oh, this would apply also when we're using tunnels. No, it's really completely absent from anything. So all of this draws a painting of a global threat, fastly diffusing at the hands of non-state actors, and that's concerning. Okay, that's concerning because we also see this growing intersection between the tunnels, which used to be used against a combatant in a kind of non-civilian context and environment, and they are now being brought closer to civilians. So how does this interface? How does this extension of this trend of urban warfare? Basically, what we're seeing is urban warfare merging with underground warfare, right? It's like warfare in general is closer to cities. Warfare in general is closer to civilians. The presence of civilians is generally exploited to achieve military gain. So it would be surprising if we hadn't seen that in underground warfare in a way. So we do see that, and I want to talk about these three kind of like possibilities or ways, manifestation of this possible trend, some of which we see already, some of which we are likely to see more in the future. Okay, so the first one is the presence of tunnels among civilians, those two scenarios that I mentioned earlier. Why is that a concern? Okay, for a couple of reasons. The very construction, the very digging of a tunnel in an urban area, so meaning just when there are civilians around, puts those civilians at risk. It exposes them to a risk from the moment the digging begins. We're not talking about the most sophisticated, educated engineers here digging those tunnels, right? Accidents happen all the time. The tunnels are dug under homes and are dug under restaurants and under places of worship and next to schools, and they weaken the infrastructure on which those civilian infrastructure actually is what's above it essentially is what's weakened. We see a lot of children involved in digging those tunnels. Of course, that puts them at risk in a very obvious fashion. When tunnels are dug, there are a lot of accidents, collapses, again, because of the lack of engineering background oftentimes, but also manipulating explosives in an underground environment, which is very, where there's no air, where the kind of like the environment is completely different from doing this above ground. And if you have no experience, then you can have explosions. So you subject the surrounding civilians to a great threat, and you destabilize the infrastructure. And what's really interesting also is that this kind of harm that you're causing to the civilians in such a way, when you dig tunnels, it's going to last. It's going to last for a really long time, because this is only the beginning. They're just talking about digging now. The digging needs to be completed, and then the tunnels will be used. And who's telling us that the tunnels are going to be eliminated? They might be existing there forever. And so the tunnels continue to threaten those civilians, and they also expose them to retaliation from the enemy. So it's kind of like a complete circle of threat and harm for the civilians. And by the way, when you dig and you dig deep, which is the situation right now, we're digging. I mean, not we, but belligerents are digging deeper and deeper. They can hit water as well, and so they can actually hurt also the supply of water for civilians or pollute this water. So when the tunnel is cross-border, okay, so when the tunnel is on the territory of a single state, okay, who's at risk? Actually, the civilians of the party who's actually digging the tunnel. So when a party digs tunnel, it puts its own civilians at risk. So we're not even yet talking about what it does to the enemy, right? Now, when the tunnel is cross-border and it goes from one populated area to another, who's put at risk? The civilians on both sides of the conflict. And that's something which is quite unique, actually, to it's quite unique to to tunnel warfare. That you end up in a situation where the civilians on both sides of the conflict are in danger. Usually, when you deploy a very powerful weapon, it threatens the enemy civilians, but your own civilians are pretty much not subject to that. So from its very construction to its complete destruction, with the destruction in and of itself threatening the civilians, those tunnels, whether they're on the territory of the single state or cross-border, they will be threatening civilians across the board. Another issue that we face, and this is more like a legal issue. Those issues are both operational and legal, the ones I mentioned. But another issue that this brings up is a gap. It brings to light one of the major gaps in international humanitarian law at the theoretical level. IHL is a body of law that is regulated primarily in order to tell a belligerent how it should behave vis-a-vis the enemy. So how much harm it can inflict, who it can target, what weapon can be used. But IHL, surprisingly or not, you can debate about this, says very little about how a belligerent is to carry itself vis-a-vis its own people. And I think I've already made clear that underground warfare actually brings a lot of questions to the surface that have to do with how a belligerent behaves vis-a-vis its own civilians. So that I call those reflexing obligations. To what extent is the state obligated to protect and to care and to take into account, for example, when applying proportionality, the harm that will be caused to its own civilians? And if you go back to the scenario of the cross-border tunnel, clearly, if you target a tunnel on the territory of the enemy, because it's an underground structure and it reacts in strange ways, you can experience some harm and some damage on your own territory and on your own civilians, and you need to take that into account. But IHL does not provide a lot of guidelines on this. It's mostly a causative legal framework and doesn't really address reflexive issues, which come up a lot in the context of underground warfare. So that's another issue that arises here, the gap in the law when tunnels are dug among civilians. Okay, hold on. Okay, so that's the first manifestation of this the growing interaction or intersection between the world of the tunnels in conflict and civilians. There's another type of interaction, which is when tunnels are used by civilians. So here you see three types. You see right away here in these tunnels, you see civilians that are pretty easily identifiable. This is a picture from Vietnam War. It's a reconstitution, of what was going on in the tunnels at the time. So if you go to Cu Chi, this is what you'll see in Vietnam. What do you see here? You see a woman giving birth. So in Vietnam, and this is something very unusual in the history of tunnel warfare, there were women giving birth underground because this was a safer place to give birth, and there were doctors and they were performing surgery. So this was happening. So you had civilians inside the tunnel, of course, alongside all the fighters, right? All the Viet Cong fighters and so on and so forth. Right? So this is a picture of a Syrian cave, and here you see entire families seeking refuge in an underground structure. This is how the use of tunnels or underground started in Syria, but little by little, the fighters and the combatants saw the appeal of the underground, and alongside, and again, coexisting underground with the civilians, they started developing a more offensive use of the underground themselves. And this is a picture from the Gaza tunnels. It's actually unclear exactly what it's about. We see a bride probably going to and using the tunnel as a means of transportation in a way, as a safe transportation for going to point A to point B. So these pictures, they exemplify, they already, I think, say a lot about the kind of risk and the kind of dangers that you face once civilians end up being in a tunnel. Sorry, I'm not. You need to know if there are tunnels. If there are tunnels, you need to know for sure. But you need to know also if there are civilians inside the tunnels. And that's actually a very difficult thing to establish. Look, in all situations, including the typical underground urban warfare that states are dealing with today, it's always difficult to establish whether there are civilians, how many civilians there are. All of these situations all these dilemmas that I'm bringing up now, they exist many of them exist, not all of them, but many of them exist in a more traditional and urban warfare type of situation. So why is the underground different? Okay, and so it creates some new legal issues, which I'm trying to outline here, but also it exacerbates, it magnifies a lot of the dilemmas that exist in urban warfare, and it makes them even more prominent, even more problematic, and they weigh even more on the military commanders. So what is difficult in urban warfare might become quasi-impossible to do in an underground context. So, for example, what does that mean? What does it mean? It could be, it's very difficult in an underground context to find the tunnels, of course, to localize the threat. It's difficult to assess the enemy's destructive capability, which is what I mentioned earlier when you have the ammunition underground. How many rocket launchers does Hamas have? How many rockets does it possess? If you don't see them, much more difficult to know. Ascertaining the presence of civilian, which is the point that I was mentioning now, is extremely difficult. So these hurdles, they weigh on the armed forces at all stages. So it could be in mapping the tunnel, in clearing the tunnel, in eliminating the tunnel. So across the board, you see this unknown factor. This is the way I qualify it. The unknown factor permeating all aspects of the conflict and of the conduct of hostilities in an underground context. So let me give you another example. So the commander needs to know if there are civilians. It will be very difficult to assess that. It's obviously fundamental in order to carry out the proportionality calculus, in order to know if you can target this segment of the tunnel or not, because you're going to kill too many civilians. But let me give you yet another example of that. When you launch a strike if you're a state facing an underground threat, and the state wants to launch a strike against the tunnel, it will have to warn civilians who are potentially inside the tunnel. How do you warn civilians that are underground? So again, it's hard to warn civilians always, right? But here it's all the more difficult to warn them. You cannot send them leaflets. You cannot send them SMS. And of course, we know that the law does not make this an absolute obligation, right? If it's impossible either for operational concerns or because you're going to lose the element of surprise, in some situations, the law acknowledges that you may not be able to warn the civilians. But still, think about it from the perspective of the striking state, not warning the civilians, not knowing exactly how many are out there. So the operational complexity here is great. And as a result, implementing the law is all the more difficult. So when tunnels are used by civilians, we're reaching another level of complexity, something which we haven't seen in our theater here, but which we've seen in other theaters of operation. Okay, going back. So the final scenario that I want to bring up as a kind of to launch our discussion afterwards is when tunnels are used against civilians. So that's the use of tunnels in an intentional way to target civilians. This manifestation of the intersection between urban warfare and underground warfare is more of a speculation, in a sense that we don't see it yet very much. And it's the one of all the ones that I've mentioned that departs most from historical accounts. In history, and I believe this is part of the reason, by the way, why underground warfare has not been addressed so much in the law. It was a tactic that was used by combatants against other combatants far away from civilians, and it was considered like an acceptable thing to do. But today we face the possibility looms in a very, very tangible way that tunnels are going to be, it's almost like the natural continuation of what's been going on so far, right? Tunnels have gotten closer to civilian populated areas. We see more civilians inside tunnels. So what's the next step, right? How can you more exploit the underground, right? Because parties are always looking for more ways in which to reap the benefits of the tactic. And when you dig a tunnel, it's a lot of effort. So you want to maximize your gain. So a lot of resources are necessary for this. So if you are able to target civilians, and civilians have become targets in many contemporary conflicts, then you're going to want to do this. So that's historically not the way it used to be. But going forward, we are very likely to see more tunnel attacks against civilians. And here, you can use and you can think about all possible ways. It could be kidnapping. It could be tunnel mining against a civilian target. All the ways in which tunnels have been used against combatants, they can be used against civilians as well. So the possibilities are endless, unfortunately. So the question here is how this is going to affect the way states think about tunnels, right? When a tunnel is being discovered next to a related area, for example, and this is something I argue for in the book, a state should operate from the assumption that this tunnel is there in order to hurt the civilian population. And that should activate a tougher response on the part of states, but also a faster response on the type of threat, on the type of states. But, and from the perspective of the law, a tunnel is used in time of war against civilians, it violates international humanitarian law. When a tunnel is used in time of peace against civilians, so we're talking more law enforcement, counterterrorism kind of a situation, and a tunnel is going to spread terror among the civilian population, that too should be explicitly acknowledged as constituting a violation of the law. So the law doesn't have to invent anything new to address tunnels, but it does have to be clear about what is acceptable or what is not. It has to be clear that in most situations in war, a tunnel would constitute a military objective. In most situations in war, when you see a tunnel next to a civilian populated area, you can presume that it's for a hostile purpose, and also in an ad bellum context, by the way. If you have a cross-border tunnel, typically your neighboring state is not going to dig a tunnel onto your territory just to come and say hi. You can presume a hostile purpose here. And you can presume that when you find a tunnel in a civilian populated area, that's probably to hurt civilians. So I think putting those assumptions out there, putting the operational complexity out there, and making clear what the law says and doesn't say is already a huge step forward. So just to conclude before we start our conversation, again, we're talking about a threat that has re-emerged. It's not new, but it's more dangerous and fastly diffusing and complex for states. Even though they have all the technology in the world, they're having a real tough time dealing with the underground. We are likely to see an increase in this interface between the tunnels and the civilians in very different ways, either because because the tunnels are dug under civilian populated areas, or because civilians will be inside tunnels, or because tunnels will be used against civilians. And again, understanding the complexity of this is crucial. Regarding tunnels as military objectives in most situations is crucial, and declaring them unlawful is also extremely important from the point of view of IHL to give the right signal, and ultimately to protect the civilian population, to tell them when you get into a tunnel, and if you have fighters next to you, or if this tunnel is used as a command and control center, this is a very dangerous place to be. So that's what I wanted to put out there for further discussion. Thanks.
Question.
Yes.
Tunnels were used in the Berlin conflict?
You mean under the wall? Or you mean in
Yes.
World War II?
Especially under the wall.
Under the wall? Not that I know of. Not under the wall.
Why not?
I don't know. That's a good question. You know, I'm asking myself a lot of questions. Why not? Why have civilians not be put inside the tunnels? I don't even like it that I'm asking myself this kind of question. They are not good questions. Why haven't they thought about worse ways in which to use this to hurt civilians? I don't know. But what I'm trying to say is that they will likely think about it. And so about why a particular belligerent hasn't thought about it in this way or that way,
No,
I don't know.
people in East Berlin, they were looking for any kind of way to cross the wall. And why it seems that
What would they do with the sand? What would they do with the sand?
Can you shake it out? We also Shawshank Redemption.
Oh, that's a very good question, by the way. This is how you detect tunnels, because you see the ground coming out. I mean, unless you have very sophisticated actors that are able to hide it.
the same way they're putting sand in Gaza.
No,
Oh,
Asa.
this is a horror.
What's the difference?
You have.
No, in every terrain, it's a problem. What you do with the ground.
Here and there.
You have the Stasi walking around.
Listen, do you know what they do with the sand? I'll tell you. They build hangars. So if you use this visual intelligence, right, imagery, one of the most efficient ways of detecting tunnels, at least in places where you don't have loads of houses and you can actually see when a hangar is being built, that's a sign that something sketchy is going on. But listen, sometimes people are very smart. El Chapo escaped a prison by digging a tunnel, and nobody saw that all the dirt that he had actually dug, but they were constantly wondering, why do the showers keep getting clogged? And they saw the showers getting clogged, and they knew who they were holding in captivity, of course, and yet they completely missed it. And this is the problem with tunnel. You can so easily miss it. When you discover it, it's usually too late. So that's another element. Of course, I couldn't talk about
The
everything.
question was if there is any difference between the sand of Germany on the sand of.
Look, I'm not a geologist, but as far as of course, every terrain is different. Even Israel, one of the difficulty where Israel is struggling with the development of a technology that is capable of dealing with tunnels across the board is that the technology that we will develop if we do for dealing with tunnels in the Gaza area will have to be different from what we use in the border with Lebanon because the soil is completely different and therefore you need different techniques, different technology, different challenges.
But
It's
in your
very
position, I
complex.
believe that it's still the answer why.
Maybe because of the geological difference. Maybe water was, above level and you cannot dig.
No, I know some soils are more difficult
You
to
have
make.
to understand specifically what are the
It's exactly my
conditions of
question.
the
What
slope.
was the reason that tunnels were not used in this?
Again, it depends on
Maybe it's
the,
rock underneath.
on
I don't
the
know.
geological structure. Maybe the
But
geological structure.
it is assumption. It's not something.
It's an assumption.
Tunnels were-
No, it's not
tunnels-
an assumption. I give you the scientific share.
Okay?
Yes,
What do they
definitely,
say?
it has something to do with the soil
Of
because
course.
the soil can be very hard to dig in, and if it's very hard to
But
dig in,
this is
it's
what-
not worth your efforts. I'm not saying this was the case in Berlin, but I'm saying definitely a huge factor influencing the digging, and also because it's so hard to dig tunnels, and you need a lot of expertise, and you need a lot of time, and the more time it lasts, the more you're likely to be detected. What happens, and this is another reason why this threat is so pernicious, belligerents, they inherit tunnels. They go for tunnels that haven't been destroyed, and this is why this threat lasts forever until the tunnel is fully eliminated. They go in places where there have been tunnels, but these tunnels have not been eliminated, and they reuse it so you can have it used 20 years down the line by a totally different actor. And that is something very, again, unique to the underground threat. Caves. Why do belligerents like caves? Because they're there. You have to dig them. They're already there.
By the
Right?
way, there were tunnels in Berlin.
They were tunnels.
They were
There were
Is
about 17 known tunnel projects.
the same.
But under the wall?
So the soil is not the answer.
beneath
The soil is
No,
not-
but I'm talking under the wall. I know that Hitler used tunnels. I know that Hitler used tunnels, but I'm not sure
Tunnels
about under the
were
wall.
used in the context of the East-West German conflict, especially by the Western allies.
You talking about 45?
No,
45.
between 40, also before 45, but between 45 and 1960, you can read the very nice novel of Ian McEwan,
Mm-hmm,
The Innocent,
mm-hmm.
about how the Allies built tunnels in order to eavesdrop and get into various communication lines of the East
Yeah,
Germany.
what
But-
say the internet about Berlin? What they said? How many?
In
Well,
Warsaw-
the
in
ones that
Warsaw
I
you
have here
tunnels.
are about 70 tunnels that were built.
70?
Between-
70?
Yes, 70, and it lists 40 tunnels that were built between 1961 and 1973.
Under the
We
wall.
learned something.
So, but Daphne, I have a totally different question.
Yeah, go ahead.
You emphasized several times the fact that you are the first to write about it. And the question relates to that because, the fact that we have tunnels, and tunnels are used for combat activities and for protective activities. By the way, if you remember the Blitz, the London Tube were used also as a protection of civilians.
Absolutely.
The question is, what is the legal innovative aspects? You describe very nicely the emerging use of tunnels, especially by non-orderly armies.
Mhm.
But I don't see any uniqueness from the legal perspective to tunnels. If you hide other installations in houses or in hospitals or in civilian areas, that it relates the question of usage of civilian installation for warfare purposes. But tunnel is not the main issue here. So what is the unique features from a legal perspective of tunnels? Or underground?
What is the difference between the underground and the air?
Okay. Those are great questions. The specificity of tunnels is like I said, there are two sets of legal issues that arise as a result of the use of tunnels in conflict. There are the ones that are the same as arise in urban warfare and are being magnified by the fact that there's this unknown factor, that the fact that you cannot predict, and you're next to the civilians. So some of the issues are worse, and the commanders are worse off in an underground warfare environment. Now, there are those that are unique. So some of the issues that are examined in the book, for example, are what is the status of a tunnel? Is it a weapon? Is it a tactic, right? Is it a domain? So I don't know who said about the air. Okay, so that's another very important question. What is this thing, right? What is it? Is it a means of warfare like a weapon? When you do tunnel mining, it's pretty much a weapon, right? You're using it as a way to, there's the explosives inside, but you're using it in order to, as a weapon. But sometimes states actors use the underground as a means of transportation. So what is it in this case? So for example, when they're discussing this with Michael Schmidt, he told me that he agrees and he believes that when tunnels are used as a way to get from A to point B by fighters, this is like a line of communication. So it can be a line of communication, it can be a weapon. I'm not going through all the scenarios, but it can be a weapon, it can be a domain. So those are legal issues that are quite important in order to determine what it is that we're dealing with, and yet they've been not examined by anyone. So that's one aspect that I'm discussing in the book. Another kind of follow-up.
Why is the definition of a tunnel as a weapon or as a way of communication relevant to the law?
Because it tells you, and this is why I said it's a follow-up question, whether using tunnels might be lawful or not in war. So that's another question that's important. It's never been addressed. So does that mean the assumption is kind of, okay, if it's never been addressed, it's probably fine, right? It's probably okay to use tunnels in war, because otherwise somebody would have said it's prohibited. And this kind of goes back to this understanding of international, that whatever is not prohibited is permitted. Okay, to some extent, I see so many hands. So it's a big question that he asked me. So to some extent, these questions need to be asked and they need to be answered. Is it a military objective? And people, by the way, that I've talked to, not everybody agrees. Is it is it a military objective by nature? Is it a military objective by location? In which case, just because it's underground, it would become a military objective. So what?
Military target, legitimate target.
Yeah, exactly, legitimate target. So it's there are all these issues that this is what I basically did. I kind of like dissected the whole thing and I highlighted which are the issues that are new versus those that are not, and I try to give answers. If you're thinking, for example, the question about advanced warning that I mentioned is another issue, and yet another issue is the type of weapons that you can use when you fight underground. So you're talking about a confined environment where weapons are going to react differently. And there could be, for example, something that a state is using which is non-lethal, but if it uses it underground, it's going to become lethal. The effects are going to be different. So these are the kind of questions that I'm investigating and I'm answering. And I'm saying when deploying a weapon underground, this is something that the military commander should think about. Another one, just I can't help it. How to map a tunnel. There's one method. There are not many methods that are good in order to map tunnels. It's a very difficult thing to do. One of the only things that works is to put smoke in the tunnel and to see where it comes up. And yet, using smoke in armed conflict is not exactly, good for your image, even if you're not killing anyone. It just doesn't look good. But yet, if you understand that there are so few methods to map a tunnel, then legally and operationally, you need to ask this question. So what about using smoke to map a tunnel if you think that there are only fighters underground? If you believe and if you know that there are only fighters underground, then perhaps you should be able to map a tunnel using smoke. So these are the kind of questions. And they are questions that have never been asked. So this is all, I'm not trying to be pretentious. And I'm sure I'll be criticized. And that's good because the point is to kind of start a conversation about something that hasn't been discussed yet. Barbara.
I have two and a half questions. Well, one and a half. One is two analogies. The second one just came to me when Eli asked what's so special about tunnels. What about airplanes? I mean, you can staff them to to observe an area. You can use them for reconnaissance. You can put weapons on them. You can use them to transport civilians. There's all kinds of uses for airplanes. So would that be a possible analogy to find out something more about the status of your tunnels? Or similarly, what about the maritime realm? What about a vessel that's, I don't know how many meters underneath the surface, and you don't have any way of sort of telling what it is or who's inside. There's no flag waving at the top of it.
Mm-hmm.
What's the status of that vessel? How do you get to decide whether you can target it or not? And the second question is more of an operational one. Maybe it's a bit stupid, but so if you want to target combatants inside a tunnel, how do you're not going to do it from above, because if we're talking urban areas, you're not just going to destroy every single building that sits atop, killing a whole bunch of civilians, but you're probably going to try and go into the tunnel, right? So if you're going to try to save civilian lives, why don't you just use something like laughing gas? I mean, the Russians did it in the Moscow theater. It didn't work very well. Loads of civilians died. But
not the best example for civilian protection. But I mean, I'm happy to consider anything.
I guess it's still better than nothing.
Still walk, right?
Yeah, it's still work around.
So, but okay, I mean, you'd rather save some civilians.
Now you've been
by
a philosopher, not a lawyer. Now you've been a philosopher, not a lawyer. She's analyzing from a legal perspective.
No, but I see your point, because it is, but there is an element of lesser evil here.
Proportionality?
No, there is an element, because there are so many things that are impossible to do that in some ways you want to do whatever is going to be the best solution given the circumstances. And I think part of it is that the law needs to understand that. To some extent, there has to be a minimum amount of understanding for what is going on. The presence of tunnels changes things. I like to give the example of the UN report following Protected Edge, which analyzed the legality of Israel's actions in Gaza. There's beautiful legal analysis. I mean, beautiful, I don't know. There's legal analysis, but there's in the middle of a legal analysis, there will be one sentence that says, "Oh, and by the way, in the area there were tunnels," and then it goes on as if nothing happened. So I think this is my point. When there are tunnels, you can't just say, "Oh, and by the way, there were tunnels." It's much more complex than that. Tunnels, they change everything. They change the way you need to rescue your soldiers. They change your considerations of force protection, which is something you hinted at in your question. They change the kind of weapons you can use and the kind of equipment you can put on soldiers. They change the way soldiers fight, because soldiers can end up fighting face to face with the enemy like in the old days, as opposed to the way they're used to fighting in more modern conflicts. So part of the understanding, and I think this is what I hear in your point, is to say, okay, yes, if you can save some civilians in a situation where even warning them is virtually impossible, then maybe you have to have some accommodation for this kind of situations. Now, I want to talk a little bit about what you said about vessels, because it's a very good point. One of the best analogies for tunnels is submarines, because you don't see them, because it's unpredictable. And most interestingly, because when they started becoming, when states started possessing submarines, they had a conversation between, of course, those states who didn't possess them and said, "Listen, I think we should really outlaw submarines," and those who did possess them and said, "This is actually a great tool of war. No, we should not ban them." So there was a conversation in the early 20th century about whether submarines should be banned, and it's fascinating. First of all, to see the kind of dynamic between the state, but also to see the conversation. And nothing of the sort has ever been done for tunnels, of course. But it's interesting because at some point it was said that it amounts to perfidy to use a submarine and not to be able to see it and not to know when the enemy is going to target you. Perhaps when submarines approach a vessel, a non-military vessel, they should fly. I was going to say they should surface in the water and put their flag, right, and say, "We are submarine acting on behalf of this state, flying the colors of that state, and we are about to attack you." And say to, like, "Wait wait a second, this makes submarines totally useless. We can't do that. So this debate is really interesting from the point of view of tunnels, and of course those states prevailed, and eventually it was decided that this was completely unrealistic. So it would be the same as expecting a belligerent who's using tunnel to put a little flag next to every entry to the tunnel. But in terms of the development of the legal framework and the fact that one of the things that I discussed, for example, is do tunnels amount to perfidy? And based on the analogy with submarines, no, they don't, because if states accepted submarines, then and they didn't say anything about tunnels, they probably accepted the fact that you have this really unpredictable, invisible threat that is called tunnel. But to the extent it was against combatants, perhaps it has to be different today when it's broadening. The threat is much broader.
So I have a bit of a question. Maybe it's something that you answer in the total book. I was an EOD tech in Afghanistan and Iraq. Tunnels are the bane of my existence.
Really?
Yeah, they're
Oh my God.
no fun. Defusing bombs in a tunnel is no fun.
I know. They call them tunnel bombs there, right? Or,
Yes.
Yeah, that's what it is.
So from the Afghani perspective on tunnels and caves, it was about using geography against us. Pull them out into the mountains, get them up where we know it, draw up their supply lines, we attack the supply lines, we cut them off, and we take care of them. That was their thinking there. When we're looking at tunnels in Gaza, and we're kind of looking from a legal perspective, when I see the way, the Mujahideen handled the tunnels in Afghanistan, that seems like military tactic. But when you're putting it underneath civilian populations with the intention that these people are going to be shields, it's going to protect you from getting overhead strike because you have civilians there, then it feels like it's automatically a violation of the rules of war. So you're automatically using these tunnels in a way that doesn't equate the same way. So tactically, they're fundamentally different, and therefore would be illegal. They would be illegal use, and then that opens up a whole. Is that?
No, totally right. I totally agree. I wish I'd met you before, but yeah, absolutely, and definitely a way of bringing troops in a terrain where they are less familiar, they're less adaptable, and they're less prepared. I think definitely back in the days. Today, probably a bit different. So I agree in terms of like the appeal. And I think what you described is exactly true. The underground is used, and this is why I mentioned elements of underground warfare, because it's really different and different. It's used differently in every theater of operation. And that's what actually makes it difficult for states, because it's so versatile. It can be used in so many different ways. And part of the challenge that, and I mentioned this earlier, is when an act, of course, so thinking about Israel-Hamas for a second, there's no doubt that Israel has become better, and the United States too, in the context of Afghanistan. You learn. The state learns how best to do this. So France hit this in Mali. I'm sure they're better equipped today to deal with it, even though they say absolutely not a word of what they went through. So states learn with time, and that makes sense. But the actor, the party that's using these tunnels also learns. And they learn about new ways, new innovative ways, new different forms of using these tunnels. And so sometimes they'll be using it as a tactic, sometimes they'll use it as something else, sometimes they'll use it under a school to gain the protection of the school. So, and that's kind of also why it's so difficult to put your hand around it, because it's manifested itself in different ways in different locations. And I think part of would help, and this is something I advocate for in the book, is for states to develop strategies to deal with underground warfare, and I expect step by step how this should be done, but also to talk to each other, because honestly, I'm not sure they do. And I think if they did, they would be able to anticipate the next way in which this is going to be used. If they talk to each other, they'll be able to, for example, anticipate what do we do when existing underground civilian infrastructure, so we can think subway, we can think sewage, but we can think commercial tunnels, I mean, endless possibilities and pretty doom and gloom are what happens when these are used to conduct, violent operations. And if states spoke to each other, then they would be able to put these pieces together and to say, oh, you know what, in the end, what happened in Afghanistan and what's happening in Gaza, there's a connection. And this is how it can morph also in the future if we look and if we learn from the diffusion until now. So that's kind of like, this is also part of the difficulty, right? To realize it's part of the same phenomenon, even though it can be so different.
But I mean, when you say that urban tunnels that are using civilians as a strategy would be a violation of the rules of war,
Totally.
and therefore it would be a totally different way of approaching those tunnels, although
Yes.
clearing them
I
from
see
a
what you're saying.
perspective is a nightmare,
Yeah.
than it would be for, what would be a more legitimate tactical
Mhm.
strategy.
Absolutely.
Which means that it's not a tunnel that makes it illegal or legal, but the question whether it's in proximity of civilians or not. So again, the fact that we have a tunnel in itself, I still don't see what is the distinguished character vis-a-vis the law. But Dina was.
I'll go back to that.
Maybe it connects. To me it seemed when I was reading it that the context of the question is that war has changed very differently since Vietnam or like World War II, whatever. It changed because it's now inside urban places, and that's tricky as it is. Even upper ground is tricky. Detecting who is exactly Hamas, who is the civilian, the context itself has been dealt, but it's just that everything has changed, and like urban warfare is altogether very complicated, and I mean it's just another aspect, as it seems, it's just another aspect or means of war that is different to what we knew of as war.
Okay, so it is the same, but it is different, and I can just trying to kind of give more further illustrations of why this is different. What I mentioned earlier when I said that what is unique about tunnels without cross-border is that they are a tool of war that threatens almost equally both sides of the conflict.
That's always mokshim. How do you say it?
Landmines.
Yeah.
Yeah, landmines also. You're right. What's interesting though, you're absolutely right. But if you look at the landmines regulatory framework that applies to landmines, it's developed. States have dealt with it. States have talked about it. They've realized that there's a danger there. So that's another contrast which is difficult to explain, right? Why so much effort into outlining landmines, removing landmines? Have you ever heard about a conflict where at the end one of the belligerents is under an obligation to destroy all the tunnels that they've dug because this is part of post-conflict reconstruction? Yeah, states have been told to destroy landmines, but I've never heard about tunnels, and yet the tunnels continue to pose a threat. So that's definitely a great example and a good element of comparison. And if you think about tanks, you talk about airplanes, but think about tanks. You can have tanks at the border. Why is it more dangerous to have a cross-border tunnel than to have tanks posted at your, standing at your border? Well, the tanks, again, they are, first of all, they can easily be removed, right? The tunnels cannot be easily removed. So that's one difference. And second of all, these tanks, they really only threaten the enemy. The civilians that are on the territory of where the tanks are located, they are not really in danger. They're in danger, of course, if there's a first strike coming from the other side, but the tanks don't really. And again, it's one decision, and the tanks will be taken away. So that's another element of answering what's different, putting our finger on what exactly is different. Is it really because it's a tunnel, or is it because it's something else? So it depends in various. Sometimes the tunnels is more unique in certain ways in which it's used than in others. So when you have, for example, an attack in the New York subway, which is underground, just because doing the attack underground is more efficient, because if it's a gas, it will be more efficient, the gas in a confined environment of a subway. That's maybe less unique than other situations. But I'm saying, like, there are different aspects that you can pinpoint, and there are not so few where the use of a tunnel changes things, both operationally and legally.
Please.
No, go ahead.
I would like to refer to two things regarding the military laws. One is the distinction between military forces and the population or civilians. And the second thing is the proportionality. These two are principles. About the first one, their fact is that the tunnels are in Gaza, so no distinction exists at the first place.
Mhm.
And this is by itself a violation of any international law. Now, the second thing, proportionality, is related to judgment.
Mhm.
Now, if we have invisibility, if we have an unknown factor, how can we blame? And by the way, the purpose of the tunnel will be revealed ex post.
Mhm.
So how can we even think about blaming the commander in the area, in charge in the area, what kind of ammunition to take, when to attack, and so forth, if he deals with the unknown? If there are civilians in the tunnels or they are not, only militants are there or not. So this principle by itself cannot be
Implemented.
exact.
Mhm.
So this is my question.
It's an affirmation. I don't really see it as a question. So in terms of the distinction, you're right. It's a violation of international law, and this is what you mentioned. Part of the problem is that when these tunnels are dug under civilian populated area, where in a very dense, highly dense environment and so on, they become virtually untouchable. And that's really the difficulty. How do you, and that's in a situation where the civilians are not inside the tunnel even. So if they go inside the tunnel, I think you basically cannot do anything anymore.
If you know about it.
Yeah, if you know about the fact that they might be civilians, yeah. So putting civilians into the tunnels is yet another level, right? But even if the civilians are just above the tunnel, you're right. It's how do you get rid of these tunnels? So those are the questions that you're absolutely right. You're talking about the commander, the burden weighing on the commander. It's unknown. It's impossible to know. So how much are you supposed to look in order to know, in order to be able to strike, in order to be able to do against this threat? And part of the answer to that question in my mind is not about. I don't feel like taking the principle of distinction or the principle of proportionality. I don't want to do that and throw them down the drain. That's definitely not what I want to do. But I think that instilling an element of awareness, instilling an element of understanding of what it means for states, and for states to say, we've dealt with this, we've had difficulty, we didn't know what to do, this is why we use a flamethrower, or this is why we use this weapon, or this is why we put smoke into the tunnel to map it. Once there is this element of understanding, I'd like to think that the application of the law will continue. Look, another problem that you have with the law is if the law is too demanding, you know what happens with the law? Then the law is being ignored. And part of the reason why I'm worried, and I'm explaining in the chapter, is that if the law is too demanding to the point where the commander has to know something which he cannot know, and it is facing a threat that they cannot counter, then the risk is to get rid of the law altogether. And this is why I was sympathizing with Barbara before, and this little dialogue that she had with Ido, where it's true that the law doesn't say that, but at the same time, if you take all the law and throw it, then it's not a good solution at all. There has to be an element of pragmatism in this, and an element of understanding of the type of the threat that the states might be dealing with, and of course an element of concern, high level of concern for states, on the part of states, for the civilians. So it's not only a one-way street, right? It has to be both. But I think this is very important. And by the way, I will add to that this risk that I mentioned, and that I've really gone to great length to explain in the book why it is that the civilians of the party that's digging the tunnels is under threat. Those civilians are under threat as well. They know it. There was a brilliant article in the New York Times about how Palestinians who live in Gaza, how they feel about the tunnels, and they are really scared about them. They know what it means. they cannot do anything about the fact that these tunnels are dug under their home. They say Israel destroyed them. They were immediately redug. And we know that for us, it's just a matter of days, and then our weeks or our years, and our houses will be demolished again. And they express this threat in such a tangible, clear way, and it makes it clear that this is something that's unique. It's not a munitions factory, and I talk about it in the book. It's not like a munitions factory. It's not like a tank. It's not like an airplane. When you have the civilians being so deeply worried about their own well-being, their own governments, right? That's putting them at risk. Then there's something very unique and peculiar about this threat, and that needs to be understood, at least understood.
Okay, thank you for your presentation. I learned a lot, because particularly about the tunnels I'd never thought about, really. But still, I'm not convinced that approaching the issue from the tunnel perspective, from the bottom upwards, is useful in developing new rules. Because I mean, the problems that you highlight, aren't they also appearing with all kinds of other types of weapons or technologies, and are just a sign of the general tendency, which you also highlight, of course, of the idea, one of the central ideas of international humanitarian law of separating non-combatants and combatants isn't working in many of the conflicts that we have. So using civilians as human shields, not knowing what, because combatants don't reveal themselves. So it's same problems all over the place. The tunnels highlight some of these issues, but where are the unique challenges to the principle of humanitarian law, or in terms of thinking about new principles of humanitarian law, which you can develop from your tunnel perspective? I mean, where do you see, where are the new ideas one can have about, is law in situations where it's very difficult to separate civilian competence and non-competence?
Okay, so that's a very good question. It's kind of like a follow-up on the others, and I'll try to press the point even further. So you're right. A lot of the issues are issues that we see in other contexts, and as I said, many of them are merely magnified or exacerbated by the presence of tunnels, and the challenges to the law are, like you said, in human shields. We see it in other contexts. So let me give you two examples of how I think this is maybe elements of an answer. Cyber is another interesting analogy when we're talking about tunnels, because it's a law that's developing, because it's this one is a totally new threat as opposed to underground warfare. So historically they're very different, but there is some element of analogy that we can use. And I'll give you something that I think was useful that was discussed in the realm of cyber that I think could be helpful in an underground context. So cyber requires a lot of expertise and knowledge in order to be efficiently fought against. And one of the things that is suggested in the tunnel manual which is an attempt at putting together cyber guidelines for fighting cyber wars by international legal experts. One of the elements that I think was interesting and I wanted to import into the underground context is that that there should be experts that are advising. One of the ideas in the tunnel manual is that there should, whenever there's a cyber operation that is being launched, there should be experts that are advising the armed forces and are able to share their knowledge and their know-how and their expertise with whoever is discussing and planning an operation. And I thought this was quite interesting. Because underground warfare, the expertise and the people who know about it is quite, there are not so many. It would be interesting, and so that's at the level of the law, something which I think could be added at the level of recommendation, but potentially could develop into a hard law, to have an underground expert assisting a military commander whenever an element of underground warfare is present in an operation. Again, it could be because the ammunition is underground, it could be because it's used for offensive purposes, it could be because it's used for defensive purposes, but at least introduce some new element that we don't have in other contexts and that we would be able to have in an underground context. So that's one way in which I think the law could develop without being completely rewritten, because again, I don't believe in that. This is, I guess, a fundamental assumption that I'm not going to rewrite the law. So I'm trying to explain a reality within the existing framework highlight the legal issues that are new and that need to be resolved, and suggest answers. Let me give you another example, which is quite interesting. I think I discussed it with Ido at some point around the course of this project. I discussed many things with Ido. So one of the questions is, when you target a military objective and you want to assess proportionality, you need to do a balancing act, of course, between the military advantage that you're going to gain from this attack versus the amount of civilians that are going to be hurt as a result of it. A tunnel is a very complex structure, as I have already explained. It's very difficult to know where it begins and where it ends. Many tunnels are different arteries, different segments, and oftentimes even dug on different levels. So when you say a tunnel, even that is like a complex thing to even put your concept, because what is a tunnel? It's a part of the tunnel, it's a segment, it's from one artery to the other, it's one level as opposed to the next. So to say I destroyed a tunnel, and Prime Minister Netanyahu, after Protective Act, said, we destroyed 33 tunnels. Yeah, well, how do you measure, how do you know what is a tunnel? How is that done? So that's a good question in and of itself. But let's go back to proportionality. How do you assess proportionality? What is your military advantage? When you strike part of a tunnel, you're going to destroy probably only a segment of it, chances are. It's hard to destroy an entire tunnel at once, as far as I'm concerned. So then how do you assess the military advantage? You're losing only a segment of the tunnel, and you need to assess. So the way I was thinking about it is to think about, if you're impairing the entire tunnel, then this is the entire tunnel being impaired versus the amount of civilians that are going to get hurt. There are some people who thought that it's just that little segment that you've hurt that you're going to measure against proportionality. So if it's just that little segment, potentially on proportionality, you're going to be allowed to hurt very few civilians because you've just destroyed a tiny piece of that tunnel. Never mind that it's part of a much greater structure, that the entire structure is going to be impaired. But it would affect the way, how many civilians can get hurt as a result. So measuring proportionality, you measure it, depending on that, according to that particular segment you've heard, or based on the broader underground structure, is an interesting question. That's another question I'm putting out there. Finally, in terms of the dilemmas, the new dilemmas that it creates for the law, I think a major one of them is this reflexive issue that I underlined. And in the book, I highlight also different areas of contemporary warfare where reflexive issues are brought to light. Example, RLEC, the killing of RLEC in Yemen in 2011 by the United States, an American citizen in Yemen on foreign soil. Why could IHL not give a proper answer to that? In my view, it's because of the same legal theoretical issue within IHL. IHL doesn't tell you in what circumstance you can target your own civilian in time of war. You're not supposed to be fighting your own people. That's a basic assumption of IHL. So I think, and there are many ways in which underground warfare brings to light these issues that are reflexive. That's a part of IHL that I argue and I advocate should be further developed. More thinking should be put into it. It has to do with force protection. It has to do with the targeting of your own civilians in war. It has to do with the obligation of a government vis-a-vis its own civilians in time of war, which is very, very, very under-theorized under IHL. It has maybe one or two provisions within IHL that deal with that. Article 58, and I think distinction to some extent, and maybe the provision on combatants as well. So reflexive issues, which are so much more important in contemporary warfare, where we end up fighting in different types of situations that we didn't think about before when the rules were created, including this possibility that you're going to fight your own people, or that you're going to have to take into account in proportionality the harm that can be caused to your own people when you destroy a cross-border tunnel. These are questions that are new and that deserve to be addressed, and that deserve to be more attention needs to be put into not just talking about what we can do to the enemy, but also how we behave vis-a-vis our own people in time of war. So this is one major aspect of the law that, in my mind, is brought to light by underground warfare. But we can see and pinpoint it in other manifestations of contemporary warfare, and they actually all, in my mind, belong to the same under-theorized problems, and this is where the attention needs to be focused.
first one on your last comment that international IHL does not
Mhm.
relate to UN. I think entire non-international conflict.
Yes,
The
non-international
classic
conflict, yes.
version is against your own
Yes,
civilians.
so that's the
there
only,
is-
exactly, yeah, you're absolutely
There
right.
is a huge.
Yeah, but it's not that huge, and if in international armed conflict, there's very, very little on it.
Yeah, but it's not that IHL ignores.
No, you're right, I should have said that too.
Yeah, as long as I'm sitting here. Two very short comments and my actual question. One with regard to the use of smoke. IHL doesn't prohibit the use of smoke for the purpose of use of smoking or either hide yourself or for that practical reason. So I think you're mixing here IHL with PR. And
No,
PR,
there's gas and smoke also,
yeah, but the smoke on its own.
toxic gas and smoke. Yeah, I agree, and this is actually the rationale. I mean, I didn't get into all the details for each
So
of
it
them.
would look bad.
No, it would look bad, but I didn't say it would be prohibited, because I don't believe it's prohibited, and that's exactly what I'm saying in the book. I'm saying there's a stigma attached to this, but if you look at IHL, actually, it doesn't prohibit it. Exactly. So that's the rationale for what I was advocating before, which is that I think when it's used for mapping and not for clearing out the tunnels of civilians and fighters and so on,
Yeah.
then it should be it is actually allowed. And again, I'm not changing the law. I'm glad you're bringing it up.
On that line of thought, I think that the context of trying to put a new interpretation or a new interpretation to a law that relates to low-tech warfare, and it existed in the 40s when the Geneva Conventions were drafted, existed in the 70s where the protocols were drafted, and protocols are very elaborated in what you're allowed to do and not allowed to do. To say that it wasn't in the mindset of the US right after Vietnam,
UN.
US after Vietnam.
Yes,
Just
at that
after
time,
Vietnam,
in terms of the chronological, yeah. I agree with you.
maybe the fact that it wasn't discussed doesn't mean it wasn't part of the mindset of the states around the table at the negotiations. So not necessarily the fact that it doesn't appear, there is no direct
I agree.
reflection to it means that it wasn't in the mindset and the laws should be even adopted. It is within the law. There is, I don't see anything new here to address it, which goes to my main point of context. Tunnels are problematic or not problematic in the context of within the context that they are being used. So it's not even nature location purpose of use. It's not a question of is it a military objective when you're in ad bellum. And you said even in ad bellum, tunnels are a problem. Tunnels are a problem when they are crossing your state line, but it could be only for smuggling. It could, and you said it could be for commercial use. It could be for a tube. It could be for anything. But the fact that there is a tunnel doesn't make it a military objective until it's within the context of a threat or a non-conflict. So to go to the point of going, a tunnel means a threat, means it's there to hurt the civilian population, means it is a military objective, therefore you attack it. It goes under the mere idea of when in doubt, it's a civilian objective. So going, as far as I understand, you're going from point A to point attack. You're jumping the big doubt of if there is a doubt. And you're saying a lot of the tunnels are used for civilian purposes. And the mere fact that the tunnel is within the civilian area, I don't see it any different from any military base within the military. I don't see it any different from a road for that purpose. To the mere fact that it's less visible than a road. But taking everything within the context of it's a low tech, it's always been there, the laws shouldn't be different, and you have the doubt, jumping to it is illegal and you're allowed to attack it just for the mere presence of the existence of the tunnel is for me it seems that you're jumping quite steps ahead. And on the use of smoke, by the way, taking the fact that this is a low tech mechanism, and we are in the cyber world, which means that we have very advanced abilities. For me to use smoke today to find out where the end of the tunnel is, it means that I just let the enemy know that I'm aware of this tunnel. I've lost every element of surprise that I might have. have robots, I have other means to use
Oh,
today to identify
That's a great point.
to map the tunnel. So smoke is
You are putting your
practical.
soldier at risk.
By using a robot.
No.
No, the robot is the best. I
The
love it.
smoke, the
Great idea.
smoke. If you want to smoke the tunnel, you have to penetrate the other area and
Absolutely.
to put your soldier on the risk.
Anything that requires you to get close to the tunnel is very.
Not if it's a cross-border tunnel. So I don't.
Okay, well, I need about 2 hours to
Yeah,
answer
if
the
you want to know
questions.
where it goes.
Okay, so these are great questions, of course. I think the first point that you brought up about the fact that it was in the 70s, that it should have been in everybody's mind. How come nobody brought it up? How come nobody discussed it? I have the same kind of, I same doubts, the same wonders. Why is it that it was never discussed in any instrument? And I think, again, the natural assumption is to think this was considered as acceptable. And I'm not questioning this. I'm questioning the fact, why did they bring it up? But I'm not saying this should, tunnels violate international law, even though nobody ever brought it up. No, I'm saying the assumption is probably that it's okay to have tunnels. But then there are all these other variations on the theme of today, which require that we think about this anyway, even though until now nobody has, had questioned the fact that it was an acceptable tactic of war. So I have doubts as to, I have some questions, I guess, about why is it that states never brought it up? It's probably because they thought it was an acceptable tactic of war. It's not the fact that an assumption which is behind, I guess, all my work. And then trying to figure out, but yet, even if we work from that assumption, there are so many questions that are unanswered that we need to address. So in a way, having that assumption does not solve the problem entirely, because there are still questions out there, even if you operate from the assumption that states probably think it's an okay thing to do to dig a tunnel in war. That's the first point. Now, with regard to the ad bellum, I didn't talk about it at all today, but there's a whole chapter of the book that talks about cross-border tunnel as a threat, as a violation of territorial integrity, as a violation of sovereignty, and in what circumstances a cross-border tunnel can be a casus belli, or under international law, a reason for acting in self-defense, or using the Security Council, which I don't think will happen, but anyway. So more likely self-defense. So I discussed that, and you're right. Not every tunnel will give a state, not every cross-border tunnel will give rise to the right to self-defense. And even more importantly, even if a state has the right to self-defense under international law, it may not want to exercise that right for strategic reasons. Think about the tunnels between Mexico and the United States. It's a strategic threat. It can be used by Al-Qaeda elements in a second to invade the United States. It's a national security threat. I believe that the United States knows that, but because it's used for smuggling, there's a certain tolerance for it, even though they're working really hard to stop them. A tolerance in a sense that they're not going out war with Mexico for this, right? But they are still acting and developing robots and methods in order to find out, in order to minimize the threat, but they're not going for an all-out war. Think about the tunnels between North Korea and South Korea. Same thing. South Korea knows they've turned the tunnels into museums. They say it's a national security threat. They haven't destroyed a single one of them. And then it reminds me of your question. Why didn't they destroy them? Well, I really wonder why they didn't destroy them. You're asking why didn't they dig under the Berlin Wall? Sometimes you ask yourself, why is it that states don't do certain things? But they have strategic considerations beyond the law, well beyond the law, of course, which makes them not do certain things. So yes, not every cross-border tunnel will be a reason for a war. Not every situation where there's a right to self-defense will be used by states. And in the chapter, I developed all sorts of indicia, of hints, of parameters that states will have to consider in order to determine, first of all, whether or not they have the right to self-defense, and second of all, whether they want to make use of it. So these are elements, this is a conversation where the law and the policy and the strategic aspects are very much intertwined. It's not just the law. And it can be for any purpose, and this is what the point that you were making. And so I explained first of all, that you can presume a hostile purpose. I think this is quite fundamental, but that's not the only aspect. If it's getting close to a civilian populated area, the chances are that the state should be more acute about what's going on. By the way, speaking about hostile purpose, I have a great story to tell you, which I found fascinating. In the Talmud, I think it's in Sanhedrin, there's a discussion about burglary, okay? And there's a discussion about whether it makes a difference, whether the thief enters through your door or your window, or whether it burrows using a tunnel, digging inside into your house. And it is very interesting. What the Talmud says is that if a burglar enters through your window or through your door, there's still a chance that they may not be a burglar. They could just be someone who's using your window or who's broken your door. There's still an element of like uncertainty as to what is the reason for them trespassing your property. However, the Talmud says, if the burglar is going underground, I promise you, I studied this very carefully. If the burglar is going underground, the Talmud says, you can presume that there is hostile intent. So that's my point, and I discovered this only after I made my analysis under international, of course, but I think it's quite interesting. The point is, if you have a cross-border tunnel at your border, okay, it's not to come and say hello. So you may have one, you may not know what the purpose is, you may be wondering if they're smelling, not smelling. One example of the indicia parameters that I'm throwing out there is, what is your type of relationship that you have with this neighbor? Exactly. So if you have had tunnels in the past and these tunnels have been used to attack your civilians, you better do something about it. So again, this is the kind of like the kind of discussion that having the book. And then finally, I think I forgot something. Yes, very important. Military objectives. I need to clarify this absolutely. I didn't say, and I think it's important because my thinking on this has evolved, and so you may be stuck into something else I've said before. But I got to the conclusion that absolutely there is no assumption that the tunnel is a military objective, in the sense that that a state may be targeting a tunnel even without further information. What I was trying to say, and I need to be very clear about this, is that after analyzing all the types of tunnels and all the types of situations according to all the different legal criteria, the conclusion is that in most situations, in practice, when a tunnel exists in armed conflict, it will be a military objective. It doesn't mean at all times, but I'm saying if you look at the aggregate, I would say 80-90% of the time, and of course in the 10% that's left, you have the Al-Firdos bunker in Iraq, which was targeted by the United States, and there were 300 civilians who died because it was actually used as a shelter. So you don't want to miss those 10%. You don't want to miss it, but definitely no assumption. But in practice, in the aggregate, and taking into account all the circumstances, in most situations in armed conflict, there will be military objectives. That doesn't absolve you in any way in making this kind of getting to this conclusion. So that's very important. Anyway,
one comment. Very important. You know that there is a very similar discussion in the 50s when they started with the satellites.
Mm-hmm.
Big situation, big questions. Satellite is penetrating, is flying,
mm-hmm.
so-called flying over your country.
Mm-hmm.
What is the law?
Mm-hmm.
And there is a treatment about it. I don't know if this guy's
No, but that's the case with every time there's something new on the technology side, states typically sit together and decide, well, how do we deal with it?
New technology.
Exactly, but this is exactly, but that was exactly what I was about to say. But tunnels, and this is what's interesting, is that they are not new. So it
Well, we exceeded our time by 15
we did.
minutes.
Oh my God, I'm sorry.
But it was really good. Our next colloquium,
2 weeks.
2 weeks from
Professor,
now,
should have stuck me before.
Michael on
Climate change and
climate change and panels.
no at all. No above ground.
No, that's fascinating topic. Very sure.
Daphne, that will ask you a question.